morning, everyone, and welcome to the Community Foundation for Palm Beach and Martin County's Impact Investing webinar. I want to welcome our speakers, our panelists, and our guests, and extend a welcome on behalf of our CEO, Brad Hobart, and our board chair, Julie Fisher-Cummings. Those of us on the call in the philanthropic sector love this time of year. It's year end. We have 7 more weeks to go, and it's usually the time that most money is given charitably in the United States. In fact, 40% of all giving comes in November and December. If you are a professional advisor joining us today, please contact us if we can help your clients with their year-end planning. If you are donors, fund holders, or just wanting to know a little bit more about the Community Foundation, we will be open throughout the holidays, so give us a shout. We can set up donor advised and other types of charitable giving funds very quickly. And we want to also remind folks that one of the newest things that the Community Foundation offers is the opportunity to set up your fund as an individually managed account. That means you can keep your investment with your trusted investment advisors working through the Community Foundation for your charitable giving. Right now, we have about 7 investment firms that we work with on individually managed funds. And of course, our own community foundations invested with our friends at Morgan Stanley. And you'll hear from some of those a little bit later on the call. Some folks have asked what the Community Foundation's position is on impact investing. Well, it's certainly an area that we want to learn a little bit more about and when we want to grow in. We are grateful to the learning that we will have this morning. We are embarking on a diversity, equity, inclusion strategic plan, and impact investing will certainly be a topic that we discuss as we go through that. I'd like to give a shout out to my colleague, Abby Axelrod Wonderman, who's the Director of Charitable Giving at the Community Foundation. She's organized this whole webinar today, and I'm going to toss the program to her so she can make introductions.
Oh, thank you, Vicki. I appreciate that. And good morning, all. Thank you so much for being here and joining in this discussion. Before we dive in, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge our soldiers, both past and present. We have the utmost respect for those who serve our country, and we owe you our deepest appreciation and our freedom. On this Veterans Day and every day, thank you so much for your service. So with that, thank you to all of you again for your attendance. It demonstrates that you are also inspired by the growing impact investing movement and its potential to really push new resources and new thinking to organizations that are driving social change. In this era in which communities are struggling and programs to support those communities are also struggling, we need all oars in the water to keep building more sustainable solutions to these old, consistent problems. Responsible investing is, of course, not a new tool. However, there are always new strategies and developments to be made aware of. And working in tandem with philanthropic giving vehicles like private foundations and donor advised funds, especially through mission and program related investments, impact investing and philanthropy can encourage significant social and environmental change. So with that, I bring you our program today. And I have an incredible group of speakers in front of me who will share their insights into impact investing. I'll share the link to their bios so you can read them if you haven't already once we get started. As the discussion is taking place, please submit your questions via the chat box or the Q&A, and we'll be sure to comment on them throughout. In the meantime, I'm honored to introduce Kenneth. Kenneth is a Senior Vice President with Morgan Stanley's Private Wealth Management Division in the Boston office. Prior to joining Morgan Stanley, he was Vice President at Citigroup with Smith Barney and Vice President in the Private Client Group with Lehman Brothers. He's been advising institutional investors and high net worth individuals for over 20 years, providing traditional investment and consulting services, including asset allocation, investment management research, due diligence, and performance reporting and solutions. He earned his bachelor's from the State University of New York in Albany, and he lives in Massachusetts with his wife and 3 children. Thank you, Kenneth, for being here and for your help today with pulling some of the speakers together. Welcome.
Thanks, Abby, and thanks everybody for joining us this morning. A pleasure to be here. It's my honor to be part of of this effort, and I look forward to more of these in the future as impact investing becomes more and more a part of investment programs for not only the Community Foundation, but for other large pools of capital throughout the world. I'm only going to take a minute before introducing my colleague who has more to say about this than I can ever know. But I'll just give a little bit of a background. My team at Morgan Stanley has been advising the Community Foundation for about 4 years now. Our main goal or our main job for the foundation is we develop and we implement an investment policy that enables the foundation to meet their spending needs, enable them to fulfill their commitment to the community. We provide an investment program that entails appropriate asset allocation between stocks, bonds, real estate, and alternative investments, as well as selecting the appropriate vehicles and managers to implement that program. Our goal over time is to provide the foundation with sufficient income to fund its operation and to grow its capital over longer periods of time. As part of the foundation's commitment to the community, they have asked us to invest part of the portfolio with a socially responsible mandate that invests in companies that score well in environmental, social, and positive governance criteria. Morgan Stanley is well positioned to help them with this, as we have been and continue to be at the forefront of impact investing. We have a group that's based out of New York, but that actually has presence all over the country, that's specifically dedicated to impact investing, depending on various client missions and different issues that are important to them. We develop specific investment programs and use different vehicles that enable them to fulfill their social and environmental and other types of missions that they may have that are specific to their foundations and their donor base. I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Bill Gambardella. Bill is in New York. He's an executive director with Morgan Stanley's Impact Investing Group, and he can tell you more about what we look for in terms of how to invest client capitals with positive impacts, and some things that perhaps we wouldn't even know to look for. So I'm proud to hand it over to Bill to discuss Morgan Stanley's view on impact investing, and with that, Bill, I give it to you.
Thank you so much, Ken, and thank you, Abby. It's really a pleasure to be here with everyone today. I do encourage everyone to read the bios. I am a senior member of the Investing with Impact team at Morgan Stanley. I've been doing this both here at Morgan Stanley and my predecessor firm, Credit Suisse, probably for about 15 years now. But I would say that I am the most inexperienced person on this panel here, and that's why I'm the moderator and everybody else is on the panel. So I do encourage you to check out their bios and see their experience. So some of the things we're going to talk about today, you're going to hear terms such as impact investing, ESG, SRI, which stands for socially responsible investing. And I just want to lay the framework for what the discussion is going to be about. And really what we're seeing, and Ken made a great point, Morgan Stanley has been at the forefront of impact investing for a number of years. And if you think about it, back in 2009, James Gorman, our CEO, launched the Investing with Impact platform at Morgan Stanley. And if you recall what was occurring back then, it was just coming out of the global financial crisis. A lot of firms on Wall Street were actually going under or being taken over. And Mr. Gorman had the foresight to think or to see that this was going to become a big part of the investing landscape, and not being concerned about what was going on, not that he wasn't concerned, but to put aside the concerns that he had after the financial crisis, he created this group that we're now in our 12th year, 11th year. So we're seeing a lot of clients at Morgan Stanley looking to do something with their money more than making additional money. They want it to reflect their social values, so to speak. There's three styles, as I mentioned before: ESG, SRI, and impact investing. ESG looks at the company's environmental, social, and governance practices alongside the more traditional measures. And it really falls down to more of a risk avoidance or integration to enhance the traditional financial analysis. They're really looking for risks and opportunities behind the technical valuations. in areas such as climate change, waste management, gender lens, board elections, etc. The second area is called socially responsible investing. This has its roots in faith-based investing, specifically with religious organizations. And we've seen that religious organizations, people's personal values, their political beliefs, unlike ESG analysis, which shapes the valuations, SRI uses those ESG factors to apply a negative or positive screen on the investment universe. And I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the so-called negative screens when it comes to impact investing and SRI. It's cutting out the alcohol, tobacco, firearms, etc. The last one, and I would say the most exciting one, is probably going to be the most, the hottest topic or the most prevalent in the discussion today, is impact investing. Impact investing is exactly what it sounds like. You're looking to make an impact. You're looking to help a business or an organization complete a project or develop a program or do something positive that benefits society, with or without the expectation of a market rate financial return. And with regards to this, we invest in companies dedicated to the research and development of clean energy, or investing in funds that prioritize diverse managers. Those are just some examples. And one of the main things that we like to focus on is, what is the client intentionality? Are they looking simply to exclude certain objectionable investments from their portfolio? Looking to target mark and how we invest for our clients. So we do their goals and objectives are, and we shape that into the portfolios that tend to be pretty customized. So you're going to hear a lot of that information from the panel today. And I think, Abby, I think we should jump right in. What do you think?
That's great. Thank you.
Great. So I'd like to start off with Lizette. It's definitely one of our senior members on the panel. She has more than 30 years. Well, actually, Lizette, I'm going to address directly to you. You have more than 30 years investment management experience. So what advice would you give to individuals and foundations that are looking to get involved in this type of investing?
Well, first of all, I would say that ESG investing has gone pretty mainstream in the last 30 years. It's possible to do well and do good at the same time to get a market rate return. And in general, it's really beneficial to look at ESG factors integrated with other financial factors, as you described. Really, in today's day and age, that describes a quality company. And then beyond that, it's really important for foundations and for individuals to look at aligning their values, or in case of foundations, aligning their mission with their investing, to really look in a holistic kind of way, to give themselves some mission and some purpose. We do it as consumers with our brands, and so why not do it with our investing? And so what's even more important as we look at impact investing, we can make a real difference with our investing. There are many different theories of change that are possible with impact investing that aren't possible with philanthropy. For example, in private companies, we can look at the value chain, the different theories of that are possible in the supply chain. We can make a bigger impact with looking at loans to private companies, that we have recyclable capital instead of just giving grants. And we can provide flexible capital to start new companies with big impact. For example, in Africa and Asia, there have been companies that have solar lanterns that provide light and provide heat in some cases, that don't rely on coal or other dirty kinds of energy. And it's really exciting. And we can make an impact, a huge impact, through private capital and through impact investing. So the other thing I would talk to individuals and foundations about is, why would you use an advisor? Really, there are 3 reasons why you might possibly need some advice. It's pretty easy to find 1 or 2 exciting impact investments, like that solar lantern case or a sustainable agricultural investment. But it's really hard to do that across a whole investment portfolio in a blended, coordinated way across public investments and private investments. An advisor can provide a strategic framework, helping with also with education, and also helping reconcile points of view across different members of a board or different members of a family, an independent third party who can provide that perspective and help everybody get along and come to consensus and really kind of get the whole process rolling and underway and actually get going and get going with that strategic framework and making all of those investments and actually evaluating the investments, because sometimes things aren't what you think they are. Someone may say they're an impact investment, but are they really? There's a lot of greenwashing that goes on. And then finally, the thing you might want to consider as you're looking around, do you need an advisor? An advisor can actually bring it all home and look to see, is there a measurable impact? Have you actually done what you thought you were seeking to do? And so I think that's pretty important. They can do the legwork and follow up and make sure that the desired impact is actually achieved. So those are some of the things that I think you might want to consider.
I think that's fantastic. And I agree with you 100%. Having an advisor, both for your financial part and for the impact, is really, really important. I know in my experience, there's no one size fits all when it comes to impact investing. And we have clients that come in and say, I don't want any fossil fuels in my portfolio. I'm an impact investor. And then we have clients that come in and say, I know that burning coal heats the homes and feeds a lot of people in developing nations. So I want those in my portfolio. So you need to make sure that you work with your advisor, your client, understand what the objectives are, and then tailor that portfolio specifically for them. So I think we should move on to Alessandra. So in following up on Lizette's recommendations to donors, can you shed some light on how you merge your personal interests with learning about impact investing for your family foundation?
Absolutely. Thank you. I think I'm similar to what Lisette said. What's so thrilling about impact investing is that it's unique and that you can apply all your various passions or interest into a strategy that not only makes you feel good about how you invest, but also can perform well financially. And personally, I love the idea of being able to address so many important issues using the entire power of an asset base. And in addition, so many of these issues are so interconnected, which makes it challenging and rewarding to work on strategies to address all of them. And as Bill mentioned, there's no one size fits all. From a foundation perspective, using the asset base to merge interests without having to change or alter the mission of one's foundation or donor advised fund is a way that I think is really helpful in engaging other board members and family members in this work. And sort of focusing on a spectrum of issues that you might not normally focus on, depending on the mission that you have. It's also, depending on your grant making process. So for example, my family's foundation grants in arts and culture, Jewish, and early childhood. And we spent a lot of time narrowing down our impact areas to make sure that we could maximize the impacts that our grants had. So now, using our endowment, we get to invest in impact and have the ability to focus on our shared values around climate, gender and racial equity, factors that lead to poverty, and so on, without compromising our grants, but with using the full weight of our asset base to further align our interests and our values as a family and as a board. And an example that I love how we got to this point was a screen that we did for human trafficking. Specifically forced and slave labor. It's a big passion of mine that I cultivated through my aunt, Julie Cummings, through her work in this space. She's an advocate and has done so much in the space in anti-human trafficking. And through her, I sort of gained my own passion for this. And we found out that as a family, we had a percentage of our asset base invested in a firm that had the capability to screen out forced labor. So we used that screen and saw what companies we were investing in that were contributing towards labor exploitation. And we were able to screen those out. It was a big help in getting us to this point. And while that's a small example and it's just a screen, there are so many tools out there, as mentioned, and making sure that your advisors and your fund managers are continuously aligning your investments with those things is possible. And the upside of all of it is if we're making more money off of an aligned portfolio, we can grant more and know that our grants are coming from a place that are also serving people and the environment. So that's what I would say.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Now, keeping on that topic of the value of advice, I'd like to pivot to our entrepreneur in the group, to Rihanna. You founded a consulting firm that helps organizations get into impact investing. Do you mind sharing with the audience the benefits and why these organizations would even want to develop and execute a specified impact investing strategy?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Thank you, Bill, and thanks for having me. So I was nodding along feverishly as Lizette and Alessandra were talking, because I think a lot of what they touched on around intention is really where our business focuses. So we principally take a management consulting approach to the impact investing world. So our clients are typically allocators of various kinds. Sometimes that's families, sometimes that's private enterprise, sometimes it's nonprofits, but allocators that have decided to do impact investing, but aren't really sure how to do that. That's sort of where we enter the conversation. And the reason that we take a strategic approach is a little bit of lessons learned over the course of the last 10 years, which I think is probably very apparent in all of our journeys. I had mostly spent my career building impact investing strategies within large organizations. And at the end of that journey, realized that the things that unite failure are actually very consistent, whether you're working at a large privately endowed foundation or a for-profit asset manager. And so our firm tries to come in and fix some of those considerations right at the beginning. Things like, what's the change that you want to see? Often we are driven to think in an output-based way. I want to touch 100 small business owners. I want to touch 100 women in this community. And that's very helpful to figure out what an activity plan is, but not very helpful to figure out what kind of change you're gunning towards. So to Alessandra's very thoughtful point around the grants and the investments sort of matching each other, you want to take 2 steps forward on one portfolio and 2 steps forward on the other portfolio. Building a strategy does that as well. What kind of change do we want to see from an outcomes orientation? And then once we have that answer, we spend a lot of time talking about strengths and weaknesses. And this is where our business gets a little bit fluffy. So we do come in and sort of have sometimes awkward and uncomfortable conversations around organization-wide strengths and weaknesses. We often have clients walk in the door with a very specific idea of the change that they want to see, but that change doesn't always match what their organizational capabilities are.
Mm-hmm.
And that's important because those assets, including strengths, human capital, time, resources, expertise, need to all be deployed in the areas where the maximum amount of change is possible. So we'll spend our time together talking about what those strengths and weaknesses are, and then we'll come up with a plan. Sometimes that plan is an actual product and we'll help structure that product. But I would say more often than not, that plan is actually just leveraging what assets are already out there. So in the impact investing world, I think we spend a lot of time, rightly so, talking about actual deployment, actual investment activity. And that is where the energy should be. But there are other assets that organizations have, like a really incredible brand or platform to message around these issues, an ability to use risk capital, to actually be very tolerant around liquidity, time, and investment constraints, and bring in other organizations that can't, leverage in third-party capital, signal to the market, to Lizette's point, that there are incredibly commercially viable investment opportunities in the areas that we don't typically think about. And then the other strength that we see in a lot of our organizations is ability, quite frankly, to put out information and research around some of the things that are learned. To the point that's been made around how important intentionality is, I would say the other 2 characteristics that are quite essential for impact investing is measurement and transparency. And there's a lot of, I think, I'm sure we'll get into it, but there's a lot of difficulty, I think, in being able to hit all 3 pieces. And so by taking a strategic approach, we try and plan for all 3 right at the beginning.
The organization you work with is
I'm having trouble hearing Bill.
Bill, I'm having trouble too, sorry.
Did I lose there for a second?
Yes, we lost you for a little bit there.
I know the little, just want you find that your with are educated on addiction.
Bill, I'm not sure if that was to me, but I think it's still cut out. Sorry.
Yes, it was.
I heard
Sorry,
something about education.
the question was, yes, it was the clients and the organizations you work with. Do you feel that they're knowledgeable about this space, or there's a lot of education that you have to also do with them?
Yeah, it's a really great question. So where we usually get involved is once a client has made a commitment to get into impact investing, but they don't really know what that looks like. And so I would say probably further down the education value chain than just what is impact investing and how do we do it. But still, I would categorize that as quite early. I mean, I think as all of you have touched on, there's lots of misconception around impact investing. And so even when we get clients that know that they want to do it, they're attached to the language, they find it very sexy, they're really interested. We've spent a lot of time actually operationalizing what that looks like, but they are familiar with the language. And I think that's probably a byproduct, quite frankly, to what Bill, you and Lizette have both said about advisors leading the education. A lot of them come to us sort of saying, I've heard about this, I think I understand it, I just don't know how to do it.
Got it. Thank you so much.
Of course.
So now I'd like to pivot to the author on the panel. Steve, you've literally written the handbook on impact investing in partnership with Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors. Is this enough to get individuals and organizations involved in their own social investing? And who do you think would be ready to use this type of handbook? The handbook can be found at Gadecki Consulting if anybody's interested.
Bill, thanks so much, and thanks for organizing the panel. I think with the handbook, what we're trying to see here is really a reframing, and this has been picked up by the other panelists as well. And in the handbook, we're really trying to show that folks can think holistically about all of the resources they have, it's not so much, and it's been picked up, it's not so much, here's my investments, and then over here is my philanthropy kind of do-good bucket. And how can you really step out and think holistically about bringing those together? And I think that bringing together that separateness is a big part of what impact investing can do to really take full responsibility for your assets. All assets have impact, positive and negative. You can't just kind of pick out, like, we're doing this good stuff and not look at over there. So what we tried to do in the handbook was to really provide a roadmap for folks who wanted to think holistically. And those folks could either be, it could either be high net worth individuals or institutions. And we wanted to really take them through this process of thinking about what is impact investing. We spend a lot of time talking about definitions, and then the who is really important, because I think a lot of thinking before you actually start going out and thinking about what theory of change, what impacts you want to have in the world, you need to think about, like, well, who are the stakeholders? And that's where a lot of really good impact investing is very similar to good philanthropy, where you really want to know who can you influence, who can you affect, and then you develop a clear theory of change, and then you start working either directly or through advisors. And we find that most people, there's a lot of good learning in the advisor community. So working with your advisor is really important to help construct your overall portfolio that's driven toward impact. Some people may start this, earlier when there were not as many advisors out there. A lot of people might say, well, I'm just going to take my money and I want to deploy it to support a particular theme in women's education in sub-Saharan Africa, something very specific. And then ultimately they learn that, well, we want to integrate it. So working with your advisor is really important. I think Rihanna had also mentioned about impact measurement and management, sort of how do you actually know how that's being captured. So we spend a lot of time on, and the field is evolving. There's some clear ways you can measure your portfolio for impact, but the field is still evolving. I guess what we're looking with for the handbook is really people who want to think holistically about all of the resources, all the assets they have, and we give some very specific roadmap on how to navigate through that. There are some great primers kind of out there that have also been done by Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisor, but this is a guide that really like fills in a lot of the blanks, hopefully, and can help people move forward. I just think before, I would also say this is very much an iterative process and a learning process, and it's not just kind of make my portfolio, flip a switch and make my portfolio socially and environmentally impactful, but rather it's an iterative process and to keep revisiting. And the field is also evolving very much, and the number of products that are out there, the depth of the advisor community that's out there has really grown as well. So hopefully, if you haven't done it, take action, and if you are doing it, keep upping your game. So that's who the handbook's focused for.
Awesome. And impact and measuring the impact of a client's investments is one of the things that we get a lot. It's no longer acceptable to say that your portfolio is in impact investing. They want to know directly how it is impacting and what the results are. And that, I think, is a good segue to go to Lizette, where clients want to have their stocks, their funds invest for a financial rate of return, but also to reflect their social values. Can you tell us about a time that an investor completed a project or did something positive to benefit society through these types of investments?
Sure. There's a lot to pick from, but I'd like to talk about a client who came to us interested in impact investing. He'd only made one impact investment when he chose us as an advisor. It was a good one with, I'll give you the name, it was Vital Farms with pasture-raised eggs, but he wasn't sure where he wanted to go from there. And we created an impact statement together. And he had a lot of different areas he was interested in. He was interested in responsible stewardship of the planet's natural resources. He was interested in sustainable agriculture and the transition to a less carbon-intensive economy. But he was also interested in the expansion of economic opportunity for underserved populations in the United States and around the world. That was very important to him, to lift people out of poverty. And he wanted to avoid certain things. You talked earlier, Billy, about, wanting to, SRI and not wanting certain bad things in your portfolio. So he wanted to avoid companies in production of fossil fuels and gambling and alcohol and tobacco and nuclear power and weapons and things like that. So, and he wanted to do this throughout his whole portfolio, but so far he only had one investment. So we started in public markets, and we started greening his portfolio in bonds and in public market equities, in mutual funds and in separate accounts where we could exclude these bad investments. And then we moved on to private markets, and we made loans that to underserved populations domestically and abroad, to help pull people out of poverty, and then to a venture fund that provided jobs at living wages in underserved communities and in rural areas. And we invested in a venture fund that had strong diversity, equity, and inclusion policies, and provided jobs. We invested in Rose Affordable Housing, which really revitalized communities in the heart of urban areas and kept them from gentrifying and more. And so now at the end of the day, Vital Farms has gone public, and we're advising him on how to manage that liquidity event. And he's putting the money back into the portfolio, recycling the capital into other promising impact investments and he's investing in chickens. So I can say clearly what came first, the chicken or the egg? It was the egg. And it's very satisfying, because it makes him happy and it makes a difference. and it's measurable in terms of lifting people out of poverty and jobs created, carbon, and his portfolio is aligned with his values.
I'm guessing client satisfaction is off the charts with that particular client.
So it was a good project.
Excellent, thank you. So now I'd like to switch over to the lightning round. All of our panelists have firsthand experience in crafting investment strategies for their investments, for their investors. I'd like to ask all of you, what would you say are the traps to watch out for? We can start with Alessandra, then Rihanna, then Steve, and Lizette if you want to add anything in addition to your recent question. So Alessandra?
Yeah, so I think some of them have been touched on, but the two ones that I think are the most important to watch out for are ESG being used as a marketing tool. You know, Lisette mentioned greenwashing earlier. I mean, that happens so often, and with ESG specifically, there's so many sort of gaps and challenges with the data and the metrics, and the really good firms like Morgan Stanley understand sort of those issues with data collection and sort of account for where those gaps are. And oftentimes funds market themselves as ESG funds because of the sort of growing popularity of the impact investing sphere. And that is really important that the due diligence process is thorough and measures sort of what additionality that fund or that investment has, and if they actually produce the impact desired. So it just takes a lot more thorough due diligence. And the other one I would say are trade-offs. Often we hear that impact investing is another form of philanthropy and that you have to make a trade-off. But there are actually plenty of family offices and foundations and individuals that have holistic approaches and have strategies that perform market rate or better. And unless we're talking about PRIs or specific higher risk passion investments that are sort of factored into your overall risk appetite, there doesn't need to be a trade-off. So in my experience, those are the two biggest ones that I would just continue to echo.
Excellent. Rihanna?
I think I would say it's not dissimilar from what Alessandra has shared. So I think for me, the biggest trap is forgetting that impact investing is investing. So in an investment context, one particular investor's tolerance around risk and return, so the risk that they're willing to take on and the return that they expect to be compensated for that risk, is the crux of the conversation from a portfolio perspective. It's not so different from an impact investing perspective. So in addition to, I think, a myth around concessionality, I would say the other side of that we encounter is forgetting that impact investments are investments. And so if as an investor, a venture capital type investment is not appropriate for your risk return profile, an impact investing venture capital investment is not appropriate for your risk return profile. And so we believe strongly that impact is possible in every single asset class. And so one of the things we see go poorly is forgetting that an investment approach to impact investing is actually quite critical to make sure that you're not disappointed with the outcome. So trying to reinforce that as often as possible.
Got it. Excellent. Steve?
Yeah, building off of what everyone said, I think one of the things I see is impact investing is not a niche asset class activity. It is a strategy that can infuse all of your investments, and it will vary across. I think that's like one piece. The other is just kind of, and we see this in a lot of the consulting we do, how do you embed the impact investing process into your investment governance structure and documents, i.e., until you're really talking and you've agreed on what you're doing in terms of impact and how that's captured in, we even suggest people to create an impact investing statement to either be part of your investment policy statement. You can waste a lot of time kind of talking about impact where it's not wired into the governance of either the foundation or the family. So we really push for like integrating into the operational and governance documents, because otherwise it remains a kind of conversation that can come up at a board meeting and then 6 months later come up again, and until it's captured, you really need to pick it up.
Got it. So I think I'd like to pivot now. We've discussed the why, we discussed the how to, but one of the things that in my experience at Morgan Stanley is is the return related to investing with impact. And we've published studies, we've had external studies done that show that there is no give up with regards to return. So my first question would be to Rihanna. Socially responsible investing is a $30 trillion industry, so it's pretty large. But just how is it making the world better? Can you demonstrate the impact there?
Yeah, it's a really great question, Bill. So I would say, sort of as a corollary to how all of that has grown and increased, I also think one of the things that we've done as a field is find a better, more holistic way to talk about measuring that impact. And the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, are a really useful framework to coalesce around common language. So I would say, Bill, in answer to your question, there are probably a host of investors out there that at a portfolio level could say, clearly I'm having impact. I'm getting cash and services to people who aren't able to access it. I'm tapping into borrowers that are completely ignored by the traditional financial sectors at home and abroad. So the portfolio level impacts have been there. We just haven't figured out a way to match that to these big, audacious, complex goals. And so in that way, the SDGs as a framework have been really valuable. We've been able to point to financing gaps. So we know that we have a multi-trillion-dollar financing gap to actually fill in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals. We know that we don't have a lot of time left. 2030, they expire. And so we, in an attempt to try and track that kind of output, I find the SDGs quite helpful. And I bring that up to say that for me, progress around climate, energy, and gender equality are some ways that we really see a lot of value and not incremental value, actual seismic development in multiple contexts around success. So one example that I'll just give, we had the incredible pleasure of working with the Equality Fund, which was the Government of Canada's first ever gender lens investment fund at a national level. And the Government of Canada essentially seeded an investment strategy around gender equality at home and abroad that would have massive implications for foreign policy, aid, bilateral communication. And so in addition to the money just going out the door from a government seeded gender equality fund, which already is kind of like, wow, just the ability to signal that equality across all sexes is actually important for foreign policy. It's actually important for national security. It's actually important for general economic growth was huge for us. And so I think some of the signaling that the SDGs have given us was really just honestly an ability to talk about the same goals and outcomes. And that's my favorite example from the work that we've done recently.
Yeah, I love it. So Steve, we know that learning about impact investing is helping the world is important, but what happens to these investments in, types of markets when there's the coronavirus, or is there a program area that performs better?
I think as we think about like how impact ESG invested funds perform in various market conditions and dips or turns, it's going to vary. There's not a lot of evidence that says, they're going to outperform or underperform. I think it's going to be very thematic. It's going to be very sector specific. So I think, and as you looked at, and I don't want to hang my hat on, but I think during the coronavirus shudder downturn, a lot of the ESG funds actually held their own. Part of that is they probably had less exposure to fossil fuels, the elements like that. So I don't think you want to say like they will always, that their performance will be tied to specific events. It's very sector specific. That said, I think COVID, what it did is it really gave us a very key example of how a risk that was kind of viewed by the mainstream markets, if there is such a thing, by the broader markets, as being very tangential on the edge. Like we've heard about like pandemic risk for a long time, but it wasn't really being picked up. I think what COVID does is show we really need to pay attention to some of these risks, which have not traditionally been on the dashboards of a lot of mainstream investors. And it also shows how interconnected we all are. You can't have market success, capital market success when we're having these huge dislocations. So anyway, I think it's, you can't really say ESG outperforms all the time or underperforms all the time, but I do think just this idea that it's bringing in new risks and new analysis, more analysis is better. You're going to make better investment decisions. the more risks you understand and incorporate. So I think that's more how I think about returns and ESG.
Got it. And it's intuitive to me. If the E, the S, and the G, and the G controls a lot of the E and the S, companies are going to have a lot less downside risk.
Yeah.
So Alessandra, with your ongoing self-guided institutional learning, what developments have you been picking up on this investing area?
Well, I think Rihanna sort of touched on the SDGs and sort of using that in an impact strategy and that the power that can have and how transformative it is. So that's a big one. In addition, I think firms oftentimes can't always provide certain services for their clients until they're asked for it. Not all the time, but oftentimes. And it's even more helpful when multiple clients that all you work with one firm band together and sort of ask for a service. You're more likely to push the needle. So learning who's in your community and how you can work together to create more offering. I also think that clients are understanding their power in decision making and understanding that they actually can ask for what they want, as I mentioned, and also that they have that power to make those decisions and that it's important to ask questions and to push back. Otherwise, it won't always get done. And there's so much more product out there today that's being offered. And with the growing attraction of impact investing, just as I mentioned before, being really thoughtful with the due diligence process and with watching out for those traps. And as mentioned earlier, there are so many advisors that have a lot of expertise in this area and that have the expertise and the conviction. And if you're working with an advisor that doesn't have the expertise, as long as they have the conviction, you can bring them along the journey if they have that hunger and thirst for it. But if they don't have that conviction, it's not worth bringing them along the journey. You've got to be with someone who has that drive and is willing to gain the expertise if they don't have it.
Awesome. So now I want to focus on our two professors, Rihanna and Steve. You both teach impact investing in a university setting. What do you see as the role of education in creating or shaping the impact investing ecosystem? Rihanna, can you start?
Sure, happily. I think I'm probably a broken record on this, and I'm sure Steve will agree. But this is the most fun thing of all the things that I do is probably teaching. And I think the reason for that is because when I went to graduate school, I sort of fell into impact investing. It was just becoming a thing. It's not like you could get a grad degree in impact investing, although that probably would have been cool. And I just felt I felt like I had to spend a lot of time carving out my own path around making this double bottom line argument that it was possible to have a career without sacrificing purpose. And that couldn't be, further from the truth today. So I have the incredible pleasure of teaching in Georgetown's Global Human Development program. And my training is mostly in an emerging market context as it relates to impact investing. And so seeing, a group of students that have absolutely no problem dedicating their life's work to impact investing plus emerging markets, they see no dichotomy there whatsoever. It's possible. And having an opportunity to see interdisciplinary learning actually happen. So one of the biggest criticisms around impact investing is that to date, maybe with the exception of the recent past, we've taken the single pocket thinking to solving these problems. So development economics is over here, traditional finance is over here, research, evaluation, and monitoring is over here. And in a really humbling way, I get an opportunity to see students to be practitioners that do not believe in that at all. Business school students are partnering with dev econ students that are partnering with measurement students that are coming together to say compellingly, we need to work on this together, otherwise we're not getting anywhere. And I think every generation thinks that the next generation is gonna save us, but I would fall into that trap. I think there is something about this particular crop of would-be practitioners that really aren't dealing with the mental math that I think a lot of us had to go through about bringing all these groups together. They just see this way of working in the world that's totally integrated, and I find that so cool.
Got it. Steve?
I think, and Rihanna's hit a lot of these, but I've been teaching. I teach at NYU at the business school. I've been teaching. It's in the finance department for the grad program. So it was a finance course, and I've been teaching it for 10 years. maybe just a little history. When it first started, it was elective, and it was kind of the people who had already been taking the social entrepreneur courses. Maybe they were sort of policy people. And what's been interesting is over time, the groups of students remain those students, but also a lot of the students I teach, because I teach a continuing, people getting their MBAs in the evening too, people who are working in this on Wall Street, and then they are taking my class as well. So I think what we're really seeing is, and so exciting that in my classes, I'm seeing this kind of post-silo world. Because it really is, it's a cliche, but doing interdisciplinary work in an academic setting that's not what it's designed for. And so I think what's fun, I'm an adjunct, I'm not a full-time tenure person, so I'm not trying to write research and get it published. But what's really been exciting is with the field of impact investing, it's the practitioners who are kind of really defining and what's happening, and it's happening very quickly. In the last few years, a lot of the academics, particularly like academic financial folks, are kind of discovering like how this intersects with their areas of research. So it's really exciting. And the other really cool thing is a lot of my students, I now run into them. They're either working at advisory firms or consulting firms or doing this. So that's the key part. And I tell my students, there aren't people who've been doing this for 30 years that you're competing with out in the market.
Yeah.
You're out there, and it's a growing field. So go and get involved. So that's exciting.
Great. At this particular time, we want to narrow the discussion a little bit further. And everybody knows that 2020 has been one hell of a year. There's been a lot of negative things in this year, but here's some facts a little bit longer than 2020. Over the past 3 decades, there's been a polarizing racial wealth divide that has grown between white households and households of color. Since the early 80s, so going back 40 years, median wealth among Black and Latino families has been stuck at less than $10,000. On the other hand, white household median wealth grew from $105,300 to $140,500, adjusting for inflation. So, and this is going to be a question for all the panelists. One area that's on the hearts and minds of many social sector investors is race equity. Grant makers, whether a donor advised fund, a private foundation, or otherwise, are trying to use their dollars for the greatest good and biggest positive change. So let's dig into this area and this last idea, especially around the Black-white wealth gap, and enter into a financial discussion. All the panelists, how are each of you using impact investing to narrow the racial wealth divide? Lizette, can you start for us?
Yes, thank you. It's a subject near and dear to my heart, and there is a big role for impact investing here. So first of all, to create wealth, we need well-paying jobs. We need access to those jobs, and we need access to investment capital. So we call those strategies workplace equity, access to capital. So we invest in managers that are owned or led by people of color. We invest in communities of color, providing access to capital really in 3 important ways. So one's consumer finance. People need basic lending, college loans, access to housing, small business financing, and equity for Black, Latino, and other underserved minority-owned small businesses. Like one example is through one of our African-American-led fund managers is an investment in Black hairdressing businesses, for example. Then moving to workplace equity, this strategy can be executed in both public and private investments by investing in companies with great diversity, equity, and inclusion policies that are high growth companies that hire people of color and give them jobs that pay a living wage. And that is a strategy to get companies to pay a living wage that can also be executed in the public markets, putting pressure on companies through shareholder activism. We also invest in companies that retrain workers for the gig economy. So education is a really important component as well on the long term. I want to tell a personal story, and it really resonated when people talked about crossover and philanthropy and, lots of different ways we need to work together. So my adopted daughter is African-American and white, and her Black family in South Carolina has no assets. They had no assets, less than $2,000, no bank account. And they called me 7 or 8 years ago. They're living in a house, rent to own. And a house flipper was knocking on their door, on Auntie's door, telling her to get out. It was his house now, pay him $50,000 or get out. And she asked me to buy that house for her for $50,000. And I didn't do it, but I got her a lawyer. And she stayed, paying her $650 a month. And now it's almost paid off, and the house appreciated to be worth $300,000. So that's how to get wealthy in America. You own assets. She doesn't even have a bank account, but she has a house now. And we've got to get creative about getting credit to people in non-traditional ways. We can find systemic solutions working together as impact investors, with public companies like PayPal interested in non-traditional credit, with nonprofits doing financial literacy. Together, we can find ways to get credit and wealth to folks like Aunt Lori and break down the racial wealth barrier.
That's amazing. And one of the things that I found is the passion that it comes with this particular area of finance, and seeing those results really does make it all worthwhile. Can we move over to Rihanna? Can you give us your answer on that question?
Yeah, that's a really tough act to follow and a beautiful story, Lizette. So I would say that the biggest thing for me in terms of how impact investing can help solve this particular problem, it is really actually already in existence, and that's working with CDFIs, Community Development Financial Institutions. So CDFIs have been around since legally, regulatorily, since the 90s in the United States. They are deposit-oriented organizations that actually lend predominantly in communities of color, typically to borrowers and savers that haven't had access through traditional financial institutions. And to Lizette's very thoughtful point about, the key to wealth equity in the United States is really about access to capital, access to assets, growth of assets. CDFIs are critical. So they completely change the way that we think about credit. One of the biggest difficulties in communities of color is a lack of collateral to be able to actually get a loan for your business, get a loan for your household, get a loan for your family. And they've done a lot of work on that. So how do we think about credit? Should credit be based on what you already own? And if so, to Lizette's earlier reference to the chicken and the egg, how do we get around that problem? So that's one thing that CDFIs do phenomenally well. They also reduce a lot of stigma from borrower to borrowee. So this is really important too, that we've learned in the context of racial equity, that we sometimes tend to act, support, spend, and invest in people that have shared experiences to us. And that doesn't always cut across racial or gender lines. That actually just cuts across, we know who we are and we see that in other people. And so CDFI is doing a phenomenal job of splicing networks together. So regardless of where you come from and where you live, a borrower in San Francisco can give to a CDFI in Baltimore, and immediately you've cut out about 7 different degrees of separation. And often that happens not maliciously, it happens subconsciously, and it has nothing to do with an inability to sort of see and recognize racial inequity. And so I think continuing to rely on organizations like that is critical. CDFIs often have a really compelling role to play in almost any portfolio allocation. These are FDIC insured organizations. They borrow thoughtfully. It's not like the borrowers in a CDFI context are extremely risky. There are guarantees and credit enhancements that are deployed in these communities. So I think if we can continue to rely on institutions like that, we really reduce stigma, but we do it in a really investment thoughtful way.
Excellent. And Steve, can you wrap it up for us? Bring us home?
Sure. And those are hard acts to follow, as always. I guess I would think about it a little bit, and across this, sort of across a whole chain. And I think particularly for foundations and people with resources, it's important to think about where they sit in the system. And I think, you can make decisions about bringing racial equity to decisions about when you say, well, who's actually managing, who's deploying our capital, where are they deploying it? How are those companies affecting the communities that ultimately on the ground are going to drive this? So an example, I'm currently working with a foundation in New York, the Nathan Cummings Foundation, which is very focused on racial equity. And we're going through an advisor search and for the endowment. And we're going out to that advisor community and asking questions about how they think about diversity, equity, inclusion in their own firms. And we're asking them, how many diverse fund managers did you talk to last year? How many are on your recommended list? So really, I think it's important. This is such a big topic that you can kind of get lost sometimes, but I think it's important to say, where do you sit? And particularly for foundations and families, how can you move this along? And to really acknowledge, I think that it's the numbers in terms of people of color who manage funds and is so minimal. It's really, we need to think about the investment, not, it's people on the ground, but also like how the investment community and industry itself needs to kind of adjust its own inherent biases in how money flows through the system.
Awesome. That's all the questions I have for the panel. I know that I've learned a lot just from hearing all these answers. And Abby, I think we want to allow our dial-in or our participants to ask questions.
Yes, and actually we have one that came in already from Michael. So I'll read it for our panel. So in your experience, there's a few questions as well, so bear with me. In your experience, how difficult is it to reach a consensus on the social values that would guide SRIs and impact investing? Some people object to alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, while others think of these as not a problem. Some people wish to avoid investments in Israel, while others think investments should be made, and sort of so on. And to follow up, how do families and nonprofit boards reconcile these differing views to come up with a unified values statement? And how difficult is it to find investment funds that reflect these values for a diverse family and governing board? So maybe sit with that for a moment, and whoever wants to go first.
Yeah, I'm happy to dive in because we've actually just worked on this as a family. So we hired a consulting firm to work with us to sort of explain what themes and screens exist and how they could be implemented, and then work one-on-one with each trustee to figure out what that person cares about, what they are don't want to invest in, what they do, what they don't care, just because they don't have an understanding. So we sort of worked on those things to find where there were points of consensus, and then the points that are maybe a yellow light, we're doing more learning around. So we're just having experts talk to us, explain how those things show up in our portfolio, what the consequences are, what the unintended consequences could be. So having an outsider explain those things and walk through each of those issues is really helpful, but also just finding those first points of consensus. And it's not, I'm also not an advisor, so I don't want to speak for advisors, but I don't think it's as challenging to find an array of funds to address all of these things, because there is a lot of product out there that addresses so many of these different issues and so many of them together. So that's what I would say.
I might just add on top of that, that Alessandra stole words from my head, which is perfect. This is why I love when she answers first, because then I can just go ditto. But I completely agree with that. I guess the one other thing I'll just add, and I know that I mentioned it earlier, but I think that's where the value of moving from an output to an outcome oriented way of thinking is. So I think everybody, we allow for a lot of subjectivity in impact investing, and I personally believe we have to continue to do that. Any objective definition of what is impactful, I think, will squeeze out people, and that's not where we are in our journey at the moment. So I think we need to continue to allow for subjectivity, but we can do a lot to push people to think about the change they want to see and not the things they want to do. And I think the more and more that we coalesce around this idea of like, I would love to actually reverse the effects of climate change, if that so happens to be your goal and you think that's possible. There's a lot of activity in there. There's an asset class approach in there. There's an investment returns consideration in there. There's a risk return consideration in there. So I think the more that we can encourage sort of ourselves ourselves on a very human level to think about the change that we want to see, the more that actually opens the aperture for the activities that we can do.
I would just say, I think there is this tendency, and I've seen, not so much, it used to be much more prevalent, I believe, where you could say, well, how are we ever going to agree on what to do because you are opposed to like plastic water bottles and I'm like believe in like animal welfare, and like it's that kind of a thing. I think part of that, if the organization or the family has like maybe some works through like its own shared values, and this, there's different models for philanthropy, and the individual trustee interest is a model that's very valid. But if there's some shared values, I think that, and codifying that, can make this an easier journey, so you can get out of the kind of complexity of that. I do think at some point sometimes this getting everyone on the same page, which sounds really easy, can actually be a very long journey. But I think it's probably worth it, and wanting to make sure that that this pulls together, that you can kind of pull it together, and codify it as well. Have some sort of an agreed statement, even if it's you may just want to be doing some very high level values alignment with the portfolio, and then go deeper. So.
Yeah, that's great. Lizette, was there anything you wanted to add to that question? I can move on to our next one if not.
Yeah, no, I think they said it really well.
Okay, great. So I'll move on to the next one. So funds earmarked for schools, hospitals, or other popular philanthropic projects are sometimes diverted into investment funds, which align themselves with certain sustainability goals, which we did mention that a little bit earlier. Does this type of investing come at a cost to charities?
That's always like I remember doing a project with foundations where we were supposed to engage with some of their grantees to see if they might like loans rather than grants. And that's always like a hard conversation to have, or that, this is fine if you want to do this, but it's going to eat into your grant budget. That I think the organizations I've seen that have done this, how to think about this, I think shouldn't think about this as taking away resources from your grant making if you're structured as a traditional private foundation, but rather, maybe look at your endowment and maybe you can invest in funds. I know Lisette mentioned like the affordable housing funds, or things that you might be addressing with your philanthropic dollars. You could be harnessing that using your endowment as well. It does sort of call into question somewhat some of the economic models of traditional charities. But those are under a bunch of pressures from different things, not just impact investing.
The other way to think about it, maybe just to add on top of what Steve so thoughtfully said, is that there are a host of enterprises out there that have been funded philanthropically, but have the opportunity for operational sustainability. So we sort of bifurcate everything in revenue generating for-profit enterprise, non-revenue generating, sometimes sustainable nonprofit enterprise. And there are a whole host of organizations that sit in the middle that could really, really use the other things that investment capital do. Like an anchor investment signals to the market that there's an investment potential here. Sometimes a first investor in a relatively underinvested sector signals that there's investment in the sector. Sometimes you're building infrastructure through your investment. There's all kinds of non-return oriented, risk-adjusted things that lets us do. I think we tend to focus on the check and what the check means as an investor, but just presence, being the first investor, being the lead investor, mitigating risk, all of that is really valuable too. And so in addition to what Steve said, which I totally agree, I would say that one of the ways to bridge this disconnect, which I think is right and we need to think about, is also the other ways that investment capital helps that has nothing to do with the check itself and the signals that sends for those sectors.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I agree. Were you going to say something, Billy?
Yes, I have a question that I'm dying to ask this panel. We've seen a lot of changes in the impact investing landscape in the last 10 years. For me, I truly believe it's moving from a market niche to a market standard. But if you could put your futurist hats on, where do you see this? Where do you see impact investing in the next 10 years? Brianna, Steve, anyone?
It was
I will,
I'm
yeah.
trying not to make eye contact. I think for me, it's very cliche. I was the wheels were turning because I was trying very hard not to be. But sort of when I got involved in this work, which, as Steve has pointed out, wasn't that long ago for any of us really. There was this hope, this wish that we would get to a steady state where impact investing as a term would cease to exist. That, to Steve's earlier point, every investment that's made has an impact, whether positive, negative, intentional, or inadvertent. And I think the future that I want to see, I don't know if it'll happen in 10 years, but the future that I want to see is that we so begin to believe, based on data, that not thinking about the social impact of your investment is just poor risk management, that we get rid of the term altogether, that the distinction is no longer needed. I do think it'll take longer than 10 years, but I think that would be my vision for the future, that my great grandkids could totally sign off and feel really good about.
Great.
I guess I think this model of like integration rather than separateness, and I think so much of our world and so many of the sort of dysfunctions are from like thinking in terms of separateness. So here's the money world, and here's the philanthropy world, here's the public sector, here's corporations. And if somehow we can kind of start thinking in terms of a more integrated approaches, because all of the big issues, COVID, climate, inequality, are very holistic problems. They're not like they're not bow and arrow problems. They're like very broad. So the other thing is just being amazed at, I think the other thing on the future, I think we really want to keep looking underneath the hood and making sure the impact investments that we do actually are doing something that we want them to do. There's not going to be a shortage of product. Wall Street can create any product. But will they actually be driving the change we want to see? I think that's where the hard work will be. I think just seeing the pushback that we've seen in the last year against some of the ESG from certain forces is a demonstration of the power of what this is. So in that way, I view that like we're getting some pushback. But I view that as a good sign. This is no longer viewed as like, as I said, like 10 years ago, I would go to like an investment conference and I would be the after lunch entertainment talking about environmental investing. And now it's central. So.
Yeah, I'd like to be fairly optimistic about this. And I really liked hearing Steve talk about holistic and integrated. And I would say that 10 years ago, it was always philanthropy's way over here and investing's way over here. And they've started to really come together. I think Europe's way ahead of the United States, but the flows are really going into ESG investing. And I think that the urgency of the global problems are really calling upon us for creative solutions. And I think that somehow just head and heart coming together, what the next generation wants, that we're seeing it in the investment landscape and the proliferation of product and the demand from the clients. So I think this is our decade. I think that we're going to see just a proliferation of creative solutions. So I'd like to be very optimistic about where we'll be in 10 years, that this will be investing.
I wholeheartedly agree with all of my fellow panelists. When I got into this space, I was so confused why it had to be called impact investing. Shouldn't this just be investing? This is just a thoughtful way to invest. So in an ideal world, I would love for this just to be a normal investing conversation. And also with what was said about risk, what Rihanna said, I mean, I would love, for environmental and social risk factors to be some of the biggest things that we look at when we define risk. It's such an unusual conversation to talk about those factors being part of risk, because risk is just the bottom line. So that would be a huge part of it, and that all firms have experts in this, that this is not such a niche that there are, one or two experts at each firm, but that each firm, has a whole Greystone team, that they have a whole panel, a whole school of experts that are working on this together because it's the norm.
Great. So we have another question. Going back a little bit to an earlier topic, how do each of you deal with clients who don't have or don't want to invest in sort of the communities such as Israel or Black communities, LGBTQ plus, and how do you get them involved if they even are sort of at ground zero for that?
Meaning that they don't, there are certain things they don't want to invest in, or they want to divest, or that there's like internal conflicts, like I oppose abortion and pro-choice. Like there's these kind of irreconcilable issues within one group, or
I think that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, that can be very challenging within one pool. I think there are very much, though, I feel like a lot of the clients we work, there's this sort of first level values alignment, which may just say, I don't want my money to go to do this or that. And that is, some people, there's arguments about, is that an effective social change strategy? But I think that's a very legitimate way to approach this. And that's kind of this values alignment, which is sort of usually a first step. I think it can move on to like other, more intentional approaches as well. I don't know if that's the example. Yeah, Lisa.
Go ahead, Lizette.
Well, we work with clients who come from all different kinds of backgrounds, and they have all different kinds of values or religious or ethical or moral frameworks, and they're different. And we really help them clarify and understand what they are. For example, we work with people who really care about climate, and people who really care about, Black Lives Matter. And we work with Catholic clients, and they really care a lot about helping lift people out of poverty. But they also really have very strict guidelines around healthcare and, what they want to do in that respect. And we honor and respect their values. It's their portfolio, and it's their money, and they they have a very clear moral compass, and we want to help them implement what they want with their portfolio, which is different from saying, there might be a client that I would be unwilling to take on because I think that what they're interested in doing is genuinely harmful. And they just might not be a fit for our firm.
That makes sense. Really, those were thoughtful. So let's do this last question. We'll go around the room. How do you see the next presidential administration playing into impact investing success and growth?
There was, and I was reading something. There's an impact investing like daily subscription thing called Impact Alpha, and they sort of made an interesting point, which under the current administration, actually impact investing has grown more as like just like counterforce against the administration. And now we may actually get some policy support in moving things. I do think that Biden has really, I think the climate moving center stage will be a big part of this, hopefully. But there are also, I think there are a few policy initiatives that are coming out. I think it's always interesting to see how in Europe, there's a lot more around like definitions of ESG and regulatory frameworks to sort of set some standards than there are here. So yeah, that's my soundbite.
Great.
I know I'm not a panelist, but I think I read recently that emissions have gone down in the US by a pretty significant amount. And to Steve's point, if we can get some policy behind that, I mean, we can probably double, maybe even triple those results.
Mm-hmm.
It could also, I mean, I think will attract a lot more people to the field, and there'll be a lot more product, and it will only expand. And I think racial equity will also be a really big topic. So hopefully there'll be more equitable access to capital and more creative solutions and more funding at CDFIs like Rana talked about. I think there's a lot of potential there to just change the way we've been doing things and actually make some of these systems more just.
I might just add, we actually just we put out a monthly newsletter. I'll put the link in the chat. But we just our issue, the last month's issue was on this, and we were spending a lot of time thinking about the fact that impact investing really is on the ballot. And I think what we've seen over the course of the last 4 years is rollbacks on pretty important legislation that opens the aperture for what advisors and investors can do. So we continue to go back and forth on the idea of fiduciary duty and ESG product integration into ERISA governed plans. We continue to go back and forth on the idea that charitable institutions can have hybrid return-seeking impact investment funds. That was the latest guidance from the IRS. We withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement. We reduced funding to CDFIs in the fiscal year 2020 budget. So what we've seen, I think, in the last 4 years are rollbacks of places we had gotten to in a regulatory framework that really just created optionality. And everyone has spoken about this so eloquently, but for me, I think the real opportunity is to really just open the tent in terms of what's possible from an investment context, and then really give advisors, investors, and people of wealth the opportunity to make those choices. So if we can put choices back on the table, I think the market will sort of correct itself.
Yeah, I think civil society will add a lot indeed. So we'll conclude there. Philanthropy after this discussion really is for the long term, but also these investments are for the long term too. And so it makes so much sense to combine these efforts. Thank you to our panelists for this thoughtful and dynamic conversation. And thank you to our attendees as well. And if you're interested in re-listening or sharing any feedback, there'll be a survey sent out to you at the end of this call as well. So thanks again, everyone, and be well.